J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, names you know. The family that actually funded their wars? You've probably never said their name out loud. For 200 years, people have blamed them for wars, for crashes, for basically running the world from the shadows. Some of it's true. Most of it isn't. This is the Rothschild Enigma. 1744, Frankfurt, Germany. There's a street here called the Judengasse. It's not really a street, it's a cage. Jewish families were legally forced to live there, locked in every night, taxed just for existing, banned from owning land outside its walls. That's where Meyer Amschel Rothschild was born. His father ran a small money-changing stall. When his parents died young, teenage Meyer was left to run it alone, in a system built to keep people like him exactly where they started. Most people in his position stayed there. Meyer didn't.
He collected rare coins as a hobby, which sounds harmless, until you realize it was his way in. Wealthy collectors kept noticing the sharp young dealer from the Judengasse. He built relationships slowly, patiently, with anyone who'd give him a shot. Eventually, that got him access to Prince Wilhelm of Hesse-Kassel, one of the richest royals in Europe. And that one connection was about to turn a coin dealer into something Europe had never seen before.
When Napoleon's army swept across Europe, Wilhelm had a problem. He was rich, and everyone knew it. And armies take things from rich people. So he hid his fortune, and he trusted it to Meyer. Here's the part most versions skip. Meyer didn't just sit on that money. He used it, loaned it out, financed trade across borders, while the prince, who technically owned it, was in hiding. By the time the war ended, a man who legally couldn't own land had quietly become one of the most connected financiers in Europe. And he had 5 sons. What he did with them next had basically never been tried before. He sent one son to each of 5 major European capitals, not to compete with each other, to operate as one organization with 5 sets of eyes. Here's the genius part. Kings only had information about their own country. The Rothschilds had real-time intelligence from 5 countries at once. Their private courier network, fast horses, coded letters, private ships, could outrun official government mail. So here's a question worth sitting with. If a family knows how a war ends before the government fighting it does, what do you do with information like that? Kings stopped being their customers. Kings became dependent on them. And nowhere would that play out more dramatically than on one battlefield in Belgium in the summer of 1815. This is the story that made the Rothschild name legendary and infamous. June 1815, Napoleon has escaped exile and returned to power. All of Europe is holding its breath. In London, the entire stock market is riding on one outcome. If Britain wins at Waterloo, British government bonds, consols, go up. If Napoleon wins, the economy could collapse overnight. Nathan Rothschild isn't waiting for the newspapers. His courier network gets word of the outcome roughly a full day before official government messengers do. And according to the legend, Nathan walks onto the London Stock Exchange floor and starts selling. Selling everything, selling hard. Every trader watching assumes the worst. If Nathan Rothschild is selling, he must know something terrible. The market panics, bond prices crash. That's when, the story goes, his agents quietly start buying up all those crashing bonds for pennies on the pound. Then the real news arrives. Britain won. Napoleon is finished. Bond prices don't just recover, they explode upward.
Nathan, sitting on a mountain of bonds bought for almost nothing, becomes one of the richest men alive, almost overnight. It's an incredible story. It's been repeated in books, documentaries, even textbooks for 200 years. But here's the question almost nobody asks. Who was actually telling this story? And why?
There's just one problem with it. Historians who've gone through the actual Rothschild archives confirm Nathan really did get the news early and really did make an enormous fortune off British bonds around that period. But the dramatic sell low to trick everyone stunt on the exchange floor? No solid evidence it happened that way. It traces back to a French pamphlet written in 1846, 30 years later, by a writer who despised the Rothschilds and wanted them to look manipulative. The real story is quieter and honestly almost more impressive. Nathan didn't need a trick. He had better information, faster, and the nerve to act on it. That's not a conspiracy. That's just being one full day ahead of an entire market.
And the numbers back it up, without any myth required. Historian Niall Ferguson's research puts Nathan's fortune at his death in 1836 at roughly £3.5 million. At the time, about 0.62% of Britain's entire national income in a single man's estate. Ferguson's own calculation, adjusted against the size of the British economy rather than simple inflation, puts that in the billions in modern terms. And by most accounts, Nathan's fortune was 2 to 5 times larger than the next wealthiest man in England. No trillion-dollar conspiracy math needed. The honest number is already staggering.
So, do they still control everything today?
Short answer, no. Not the way conspiracy videos want you to believe. The fortune, once concentrated in 5 brothers, split across generations, wars, and countries. 2 world wars hit European banking families hard. The Rothschild banks in France and Austria were seized by the Nazis during World War II, and while parts of the business were rebuilt after, the empire never returned to its 1800 scale. Today, the name still exists in banking, mainly through Rothschild & Co., a legitimate, publicly known investment bank. Successful, respected in finance circles, but one firm among many. Not a secret hand steering the global economy. And yet, the myths never stopped growing. Blogs, forums, documentaries have spent 2 centuries claiming the family secretly controls world governments, central banks, even wars. Almost none of it holds up when you check the sources. Most of it traces back to the exact same kind of pamphlet that invented the Waterloo conspiracy back in 1846, which says more about human nature than it does about the Rothschilds. We like our villains secret and eternal. The truth, a family that got extraordinarily powerful for about 100 years, then faded like every other empire, is somehow less satisfying.
Here's what's actually true. No myth required. A boy who wasn't legally allowed to own land built a network that kings depended on. That alone is one of the greatest financial stories ever recorded. He didn't need a secret society. He didn't need to control the world. He just knew things one day before everyone else did. And so did his sons.
And in the end, that one-day head start built an empire that outlived him by 2 centuries. Myths, legends, and all. If you want more stories the history books buried, subscribe to the Capital Tales.